Out of the many types in Yu-Gi-Oh!, by far my favourite is Fiends. I mean, this is my favourite card of all time, this is my favourite deck of all time, and this is the deck I've played the most over the last few years. And I'm sure you've seen at least one of my Fiendsmith profiles on this channel if you're a regular viewer, just to give you an idea how much I love the weird ghouls, goblins and demons of Yu-Gi-Oh! Out of all the types in Yu-Gi-Oh!, Fiends tend to have the best art in my opinion, with a diverse array of spooky, creepy art, in the same way as zombies. Yet unlike their undead counterparts, Fiends have a much more diverse array of looks to suit any taste, from the gross horror like the Archfiend cards, to the Burning Abyss cards drawing influence from biblical demons. If we got something more cute, we got cards like Togepi from the Underworld and the Live Twins, as well as the beauties that are the Labyrinth Maidens and the Fiendsmith monsters. And it's not merely aesthetic either, however, as through most of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, some form of Fiend strategy has been a factor in the meta, from the very beginning where Summoned Skull was the first true boss monster, to Yatagarasu's Reign of Terror, all the way to Burning Abyss and Labyrinth being two of the longest played decks in Yu-Gi-Oh history. And even recently, Fiendsmith have taken numerous decks to the top, with Fiendsmith Rise Yellow in particular being one of the best decks we've seen in the last couple of years. However, in GOAT format, Fiends are in a bit of a dead zone, and I don't mean the graveyard either. Too late for all-powerful Fiends like Summoned Skull to be relevant anymore, but too new for Dark Worlds to be a thing. GOAT format is a format with a disturbing lack of Tier 1 Fiends, with the most being dominated by spellcasters and warriors. However, that's not to say that Fiends have no presence in GOAT format at all, as cards like the Dark Mimics and Night Assault have seen consistent play in both GOAT Control and Chaos builds, and there are many other powerful Fiends in GOAT that I've seen fringe play over the years. It's just that compared to other types like Warrior, there isn't much meta spots for Fiends. And with Rise of Gravekeeper's Spy as a near must play, even Fiends that used to see a lot of play, like Slate Warrior, have kind of started to fall off. However, this doesn't mean that Fiends are unplayable as a toolbox deck themselves. In fact, unlike the likes of Warrior Toolbox or Beast Aggro decks, one advantage a Fiend deck has in GOAT format is that it's probably the most flexible type focused deck in the format. While most decks like Warrior and Beast are pure aggro, and we've got a few control-focused archetype decks like Spirits, Fiends has the ability, depending on how they're doing, to play both roles, possessing many large beaters for aggressive early plays that then smoothly transition into the later game large Fiends that can control the board with huge bodies and powerful effects. Is this one of GOAT's best decks? No. In the right hands though, can it give the top decks run for their money? Yes it can. There's lots to unpack here, so let's channel our evil Millennium Ring dwelling spirit and get right into GOAT format Fiends. Now, like other type-focused decks in GOAT format, Fiend Beatdown needs reason to lean so heavily into this one type. After all, GOAT is a format from long before Yu-Gi-Oh became an archetype-focused game, where decks were encouraged to play a far narrower pool of cards. And in fact, the most optimal way to play GOAT is mixing the best cards from a bunch of attributes and types together in the vein of the two best decks, Chaos and GOAT Control. Decks that differ from this line of thinking tend to either be hyper-focused combo decks, or a tribal deck that has one powerful card they synergize around, which makes excluding other types worth it. Warrior, for example, has Reinforced to the Army, which makes the whole deck one huge toolbox, and Beatdown has Enraged Battle Ox to give most of our deck piercing damage. So what does Fiend have to make it worth playing just Fiends? How about access to 4 copies of one of the best effects in GOAT format? You see, like any other deck, Fiends are likely going to have a bunch of cards hit the graveyard over the course of a long, grindy game of GOAT, and those cards can be used to summon one of the best Fiends at the time, Dark Necrofear. The ace monster of Bakura in the anime, Necrofear is essentially our equivalent to Blackluster Soldier, because it's our boss monster that requires a banish, in this case 3 Fiends, to bring it out. And while it may seem like a pretty weak card for such a steep cost, what it lacks in power, it makes it fall with a very brutal effect. That being that during the end phase when this card is destroyed by an opponent's card, it becomes a better snatch steal. Equipping itself to an opposing monster, this card lets you take control of it for as long as it remains equipped, except unlike Snatch Steal, this card doesn't grant opposing players any life gain, making Necrofear a better option versus control-focused decks that want the game to go as long as possible. Now, while not at the same power level as the Trinity, you could argue that along with Heavy Storm, Sagittarial is the next most powerful spell in GOAT due to the many different uses this simple effect has. It can be both a piece of non-destructive removal and a way of shoring up a deck's weaknesses by taking pieces from the opponent that we can use for ourselves, like most prominently Chaos Monsters, but also Thousand Eyes Restrict and cards like Infecting Virus, or even cards like Breaker if we need to pop back row. So as you can imagine, playing 2 or 3 extra copies of this card is pretty powerful, especially when the card effect can also be used to fuel another of GOAT's most powerful spells, but we'll talk about that a bit later on. Next up, we've got another card played by Pecora in the anime. How does a guy with a 1-3-1 record have a better deck than all the main characters? And my pick for the most underrated card in GOAT format, Dark Ruler Hades. A behemoth at 2450 attack points for 1 tribute, Hades will be worth playing just because of his stats, as I think not named BLS or DMOC can't really beat this guy in battle very often. However, there's more to this guy than just being a big beater who gets wrecked by Dark King of the Abyss in like 20 different card arts. Now, I covered this card in a recent short, so I'll be quick on this one. Dark Ruler has the effect to turn off any other effect of any monster your fiends beat in battle. Now, at first when I read this effect, I thought it just turned off graveyard effects, which would already be pretty powerful as would turn off the effects of Sangan, the spell ruler recruiters like Shining Angel, and cards with on-destruction effects like New Doria, for example. However, no, this card actually does a lot more than that. You see, if this card shuts off any effect if any monster is struck by a fiend, any effect that's not a graveyard effect but wouldn't trigger till after the monster is already dead, like flip effects for example, are also caught in this card's Soul Drain effect, making this a hell of a lot stronger than I thought at first, as this one card gives the deck a massive advantage versus control decks, but not only stopping them from getting more monsters out with recruiters, but also from getting new resources with the likes of Magician of Faith, Mask of Darkness, Magical Merchant, and Night Assailant. For the third major reason we play this deck, we have Giant Orc. Essentially the dark equivalent of Goblin Attack Force, and that is another 2k level 4 beater who has the downside of a force change into defense after an attack. Orcs serve the same dual purpose here that Goblins do in Earth Aggro, beating over Gravekeeper's Spy and its ilk, and then fooling the deck's banish monsters when they inevitably die on the crackback. Now, this may not sound important, but in modern GOAT, if you're looking to play an aggressive deck, you need to be able to out Gravekeeper's Spy fairly reliably, or it's just going to stick on the board, summon a second copy of itself, and stall you out till the controller's got enough resources to overwhelm your aggro strategy, or if you're playing against Gravekeepers, till they get big enough to just kill you in battle. So this is essentially about why Beatdown is far out of the meta, by the way, as only a fully powered bazooka can break through this massive wall. So we've covered what I consider the core pieces of this strategy, so let's move on to other powerful includes that may not be mandatory in all builds, but would strongly be recommended playing them depending on what kind of build you're going for. This section is dedicated to players who want to lean more heavily into the Dark Necrofear synergy while also potentially splashing BLS. First up, we have one of GOAT's best ways of getting Dark Fiends into the graveyard in Giant Germ. A level 3 Dark Fiend monster, Giant Germ, like a real virus, spreads from contact. As when it's destroyed in battle, it lets you summon 2 more copies of itself from the deck and then burn the opponent for 500 life points. So essentially, the Dark counterpart is Nimble Momonga, except this card actually makes the game go quicker as opposed to dragging it out for over 10 more minutes. However, in addition to its burn effect, Germ is one of the most effective ways of filling the grave we have in this deck. Being able to be summoned, die, and the next turn, we can either crash our Germs, let them die themselves, or tribute them for hard deaths, giving us potentially 3 Fiends in the graveyard and a potential early game Dark Necrofear. Next we move from a card played by Kaiba to one of Yugi's signature cards in Kuribo. They may not realise this, but Kuribo was actually a part of Yu-Gi-Oh history, as was the first ever hand trap made for Yu-Gi-Oh, being released all the way back in Metal Raiders, and in many ways it set the standard for most modern hand traps with its low level and weak stats instead of you to keep it in your hand. The thing it lacks is it's not a tuner, for obvious reasons. However, what Kuribo does lack compared to the better hand traps that came after it is an effect that has a big impact on the field, as all this card does is provide a one-shot burst of damage protection when being discarded. Now this has its purposes versus decks like Panda Burn, for example, as it can keep you from getting one shot, and against decks like Earth Aggro it can be one of the best ways of dealing with Goblin Attack Force, as once it attacks it will be locked in defense for a turn without actually having done any damage. However, consider this a nice little bonus, as all this card is really here for is filling up the graveyard, as like most old Yu-Gi-Oh cards, this card doesn't have a once per turn clause, meaning with multiples we can very easily turbo out Dark Necrofear early, as they're controlling the field by beating over normal summon monsters, and if they get to the later game, taking control of their bigger threats once Necrofear hits the yard. Now, Dark Necrofear is the main reason we run the heavy Fiend package we do. However, one benefit of going so heavy on this type is that Fiends have two of the strongest monster destruction effects stapled to a normal summonable body in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! At this time, involving Night Assailant and Newdoria, and thanks to them providing bodies for Necrofear and Chaos cards, we can max out on both, making this one of the best decks in GOAT when it comes to killing monsters. Starting off, we have Night Assailant, which is essentially the best version of Maya to Bug. Not only can it pop a monster upon being flipped, but also more famously, it can add any flip monster back to your hand upon being discarded, which back in GOAT also includes another copy of itself. Admittedly, this is not as useful here as in decks like GOAT and Chaos Control, where they've got access to many flips they can get back to their hand with this effect, but setting up the right Assailant loop of having one in grave and one in hand consistently recycling each other still has many uses in this deck. Firstly, it makes Splash into Infecting Virus one of the best things you can do in this deck, as we can run a loop of discards, which turns this card into Raigeki on legs. Secondly, it allows us to run removal cards that acquire discards like Wing Blast and Raigeki Break, cards we already want to run to fuel Necrofear, by the way, without losing resources if Necrofear is unavailable. And finally, once we run out of uses for the loop, it leaves us a Night Assailant in our hand, tagged as removal before both of them become Necrofear fuel. By contrast, Newdoria's use in this deck is relatively simple. A 1200 attack Fiend, this card destroys monster upon being destroyed, making it a good set, a way of outing small flips before it inevitably dies, and one of the better cards to fuel Necrofear, as you can crash into a monster, kill that monster, and then summon Necrofear, taking another monster, decimating your opponent's board. Now, this is nowhere near the end of the removal we have in this deck, but we'll save that for the back row section. So now, let's moving on to cards seen in more aggressive versions of this deck. We run the biggest 4-star Fiends, named Giant Orc, in Archfiend Soldier with 900 attack points, Opticlops with 800 attack points, and Twin-Headed Warwolf with 1500 attack points, and an effect that shuts down any flip it destroys, provided you control another Fiend, making it essentially a mini Hades in some ways. In addition, we also run Slate Warrior in this more aggressive version of Fiends, as 1, it has 900 attack points, and 2, it has both a powerful flip and graveyard effect, with the flip boosting its stats by 500, and its graveyard effect reducing the opponent's monster that destroyed it by 500. Now, the graveyard effect is really powerful versus big monsters, as it makes it easy for Hades and Necrofear to run them over in battle. But I want to focus on the flip effect, because not only does it make Slate Warrior another way to out Gravekeeper's Spy, but more importantly, it also makes it a Night Assailant target, giving this deck a beta that can be recycled at least twice, making this deck better than many aggro decks in grindier, longer games. And to finish off our monster lineup, we have a very limited amount of generic staple space to show up the holes in our Fiend game plan. Firstly, most prominently, we have of course the Chaos package, consisting usually of one BLS and a playset of Thunder Dragons to meet the light requirements. Next up, we have Infecting Virus, as discussed earlier, as a powerful card anyway, but combined with the nice loop I mentioned earlier, it gives a Raigeki on legs, which is insane in a format as anti-board wipe as GOAT. Some builds also run Breaker, as he's both a solid piece of back row removal and another large 4-star beater, meaning early he can stand with Orc and other big Fiends, and late game he can help clear the way for big threats like Hades and Necrofear to finish the job. And finally, of course, we have Sangan, which is not only a Fiend monster that can be used for Dark Necrofear, but also a toolbox that can search as most of our important Fiends to either boost our graveyard, provide removal, or even help win us the game in time. Moving on to the spell cards, I'll be honest, in the more competitive builds of this deck, we aren't playing anything that special, just mostly the basic staples. This includes Snatch Steal, obviously, because why play 2 or 3 when you can play 3 or 4. We also of course run the trinity of Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity and Delinquent Duo, with Graceful in particular being a powerful starter in decks looking to turbo out Dark Necrofear. In addition to this, we also run the Man of Crossout, because we really don't want control players getting too much advantage over us early. And we also of course play Premature Burial for our staples, and that is the basic spell lineup for this deck. However, when Nova Athos took this deck to go Championship 13 with a Chaos engine, there are a few unique spells in his list I want to talk about. Firstly, he was running Lightning Vortex and Giant Trunade for additional ways of clearing the field, which in aggro decks is understandable as you're often going to lose in the grind game, so the more ways you've got of hitting face early with big monsters, the better. He was also playing Creature Swap as a way to work with Giant German Sangan. And finally, we've got to mention Fusion. A normal spell, this card brings back any amount of banished cards from both players' banished zone at the cost of 2000 life points. Now yes, this card can absolutely help your opponent as well, especially when they are on a chaos strategy. However, with the proper setup and this deck's fast pace, it's not difficult to do this before the opponent has a chance to get much use out of it. And compared to how much this card does for us, it's often worth it to get 3 big beaters banished off of Necrofear or 2 off of BLS. And if the opponent does summon something big, just crash Necrofear into it and steal it for yourself. For the first tech choice in this deck, we got a card that, to be honest, had I seen it in my Every Card in the Ancient Sanctuary video that I'm going to be making at some point, I would have likely dismissed with a 2-word sentence for seeing it here, Thraben Nightmare. Level 4 Light Fiend, all this monster does is double its attack points when both your hand and back row are empty, so that admittedly does give this card a decent body in a top deck war, but also makes it a non-bow with Snatch Steal, as the player who popularised this card pointed out in his GoFormat.com interview, link below by the way. No, the reason we run this card is the same reason many decks these days were playing bad cards. It's a Light Fiend. Yep, that's right, Engraver and his crew are so ubiquitous, they found a way to travel back in time and send themselves into GOAT format. Okay, the real reason we play these cards is that with this card being both a Light and a Fiend, this card can serve as bash fodder for both Dark Necrofear, whilst making it easy to splash BLS without deviating too much from the Fiend theme. As per in this card and a Thunder Dragon package, you pretty much have enough of a Light engine to splash BLS, while still giving you the amount of Fiends necessary to consistently get out Dark Necrofear. Another option you can consider for more control-focused builds of this deck is a level 1 package to go with Karibo in the form of Goblin King and Dark Mimic level 1. Why? Well, first, Mimic lets you draw a card on a flip, meaning you can both fill your graveyard and your hand in one card, and Goblin King can grow massive to help OTK. But of course, the main reason you want to play these cards is to synergize with Metamorphosis without bogging your deck down with Scapegoat to allow you to access Thousand Eyes Restrict, which both gives us an out to BLS and gives us a way to defend against faster decks like Cat Combo and Cyberstein thanks to its Spellbinding Circle blanketing effect. In addition to this, our deck plays level 1, 2, 4, 6 and 8 star monsters, and also a Necrofear and Snatch Steal package, giving us a massive pool of fusions to work with, while also again fueling the yard for BLS and Necrofear. And trust me, sending one of those cards with a Gatling Dragon is not fun or easy to manage. And to finish this guide, I'm going to show you the dumbest player I've ever considered for one of these videos. Now, Dark Necrofear has 2 properties that make what I'm about to say possible. 1, they're easy to summon level 8, and 2, those ones use their effect very often, they will die a lot. As such, they will often fire off the conditions to activate a Deal with Dark Ruler. A quick play spell, Deal with Dark Ruler, while being fitting for this deck, can only be used when a level 8 or higher monster we control is sent to the graveyard. It lets us summon the card Berserk Dragon from our hand or deck. Now yes, there's at least 4 bricks in the deck, and I wouldn't recommend this to any Fiend deck trying to play seriously, but if your play goes at a more casual level and wants to summon something unique, I highly recommend this combo. So what does Berserk Dragon do? Well, being one of the few cards that were translated 100% accurately from the anime, this Defender Attack Point Behemoth can attack all monsters in the opponent's field once each, and sadly they also kept the tacked on downside of losing 500 attack points each turn. So essentially, find a way to give this card piercing, and that's an OTK versus any Scapegoat deck, or any deck with a lot of low stat flip monsters. And versus Chaos, this card can only OTK on a board full of non-Chaos monsters, but can run over Sork for 3 turns, and on the turn it's summoned it can take on BLS even, or crash with it the second turn it's on the field. Add on to this the Dark Necrofear Steal you'll get on the turn you summon this card, and pulling this combo off will likely result in a win very fast if the opponent can't out-Dragon or the Necrofear equip. Again, I must stress that I'm only recommending this line for the most casual of play. Anyone who tries to play 3 deals along with 3 Necrofear in a competitive list does so at their own risk. The only way I can think of making that viable would be to play a Skill Drain package and its ilk, which to be fair does have synergy with our large beaters, so it's not awful I guess, but I would recommend just playing a deck full of more normal summonable beaters like Soldier and Orc if you wish to go down the beatdown route to that extent. Finally, let's look at our side deck, beginning with arguably the best floodgate in GOAT format, Skill Drain. A continuous trap, this card for the cost of 1000 life points turns to the effects of all monsters on the field. This not only turns you into a very simple game of who has the bigger monsters, a way of playing more likely to win by the way with all of our big beaters, but it also gives us a big advantage because effects in the graveyard are affected by this card, and between Necrofear, Assailant and the regular GOAT cards we have a lot more than a lot of decks do outside of control, so there could be a lot of decks with just this one card. Adding on to this, we can also run Royal Command as another 3 pseudo-skill drains, as they turn for the effects of all flip monsters. Not just flip effects, but all their effects. This card was used against Shaddoll back in the day, and is really good in this format against Control, which as established is our biggest threat. As a frog player in Airstyle, I hate to bring this one up, but as a deck full of dark monsters with large stats, we can also run Deck Devastation Virus, as we have crush carding a large amount of cards from the opponent's deck, like Gravekeeper's Spy, Magician of Faith, Magical Merchant, etc. And if you really hate flip monsters, we can also run Ceasefire to both show off their effects and burn the controller, and no mana cross out if you want to banish or copies of one flip monster from the opponent's deck and field. On the flip side, if like Nova Aethos you want to play almost no traps at all, you can just run Royal Decree to cut off your opponent's access to them as well. Chaos Sorcerer can also be slotted in for more removal and Chaos Fair into this deck, and for more aggressive versions we can run Hand Attack like Duo and Trap Does Shoot to snipe answers from our opponent's hand that can prevent us from winning fast. Is Fiend Beatdown a good deck for GOAT format? Debatable. Will this deck ever be top tier? No, and in fact with cards like Wing Blast seeing more play than ever, it's arguably never been weaker. However, is it a unique take on type-focused decks that can steal a win versus the top decks with the right draws and a good pilot? Absolutely. I truly believe that a good enough player could take this deck and use a tuned version to absolutely decimate GOAT and Chaos decks, with ways to shut down most of what makes those decks tick, and I'm glad I was able to show you guys a way to play my favourite type in a way I think even Bakura would be proud of. So if this looks appealing to you, give it a try and start selling those meta players to the Shadow Realm. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all very soon.